Hi, everybody. I'm Jeff Mayers from WisPolitics.com here with another of our virtual luncheons. Today it's on a new book out by Dennis Dresang, Patrick J. Lucey, A Lasting Legacy. We're going to get to the panel discussion in a moment, but I want to thank our sponsors for this Madison event series. We would usually hold these at the Madison Club, but of course, everything's virtual these days. So I thank our sponsors for supporting this effort. The Wisconsin Hospitals Association, ARP Wisconsin, Xcel Energy, Walmart, American Family Insurance, and Hush Blackwell. We also have some other events coming up, including tomorrow, a special event at this time during the lunch hour on looking at the female vote in Wisconsin with a great panel, 3 female voters from different generations, plus former Lieutenant Governor Rebecca Clayfish and Senate Minority Leader Janet Bewley. Then we have on October 2, we have a look at the top issues in the presidential race with experts from the La Follette Institute. That's a little nod to you, Dennis. And then October 8th and 9th, we're going to have the second annual Midwest Polling Summit. And that's over 2 days, October 8th and 9th during the noon hour. You can find out details at WisPolitics.com. And then October 15th, another noontime event with this set of sponsors. We're going to be looking at the top state Senate races. But today, as I said, we're going to be talking about really exciting to talk about this great history of Wisconsin. This new book by Dennis Dresang, Patrick J. Lucey, A Lasting Legacy. And we have a great panel in addition to Dennis. We have Pat Lucey's daughter and a voting rights attorney in Georgia, Laurie Lucey. We have 2 top Lucey advisors from the day, Joe Sensenbrenner, who is also mayor of Madison, and Jim Wood, who was a member of the administration, of course, and a PR man extraordinaire. So welcome, all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So Dennis, first to you. You know, you lived this history, you know, and observed it closely, and then you wrote the book. But there's a story behind the book. Can you tell us a little bit about the making of the book and how you got involved and how you took on this mission?
Sure. It did have a rather unusual beginning. The whole project began with 2 individuals. One, David Adamany, who was a former colleague of mine at the University of Wisconsin in the political science department. And he was very, very close to Pat Lucey. He was in the cabinet and the like. And then Neil Shively, who was a retired reporter from the then Milwaukee Sentinel before the Sentinel became merged in with the Milwaukee Journal. Neil and David separately were gathering material and getting ready to write a book on Pat Lucey. They had actually talked to me separately about their projects, and they unfortunately both died before they were able to finish the project. Neil started doing a little bit of drafting. David gathered a lot of material, over 24 boxes of material, but he didn't even get a chance to start outlining the book. And they both died. And Doreen Adamany, David's sister, pulled together a group of people and they brainstormed about, well, who can finish this project? And my name came up, and I was presented with the opportunity, and I jumped at it because it was not only an opportunity to do a biography of an extraordinary man and political figure in Wisconsin history, but it was also an opportunity to add to our understanding of Wisconsin history. The Wisconsin Historical Society has published a 6-volume series on Wisconsin, but it stops at 1965. And that is before we have the late 60s and 70s covered, when Pat Lucey and those around him launched the most productive, progressive period since Fighting Bob La Follette and Francis McGovern. So it was really an opportunity to do two things, as I said. One, write about Pat Lucey and also learn more about him, but also cover that period of history, which is so critical to our state.
So hold up a copy of the book, Dennis. And we also have a excerpt of the book at wispolitics.com. And it's published by the Wisconsin Historical Society Press. And on the back cover is quite a tribute from Tommy Thompson, the longest serving governor, who borrowed a lot of tricks from the Lucey administration. So that's worth a read all on its own. So thank you,
And
Dennis.
you'll notice that on the cover is Joe Sensenbrenner. So
Joe, you've hardly changed.
That's my opinion.
So anyway, well, let's just go to Joe, since you're on the cover, and talk about 50 years ago this fall, Pat Lucey was elected governor, the first four-year governor. What do you think his mindset was going into that?
Well, I'm not sure, but reflecting on particularly helpful memories, I remember his saying a bit of really important political advice. The room kind of got quiet. And he said, always run against really weak opponents. And then he burst out laughing, because you can't pick your opponent except in very rare circumstances. I think part of his circumstance was he met the times. He was not a good retail politician. He was a tactician. He was a study of the civic levers of doing things. But if there was a room full of people, he was unlikely to come to your attention. And he sort of waited in line. He had other people that he worked hard with, and they became governor, they became senator, and then it was his turn. And he had two opponents that were not strong, which allowed him, with his skill set, to shine. So I think he probably felt fortunate, because he knew he couldn't compete against Lee Sherman Dreyfus. He couldn't compete against Tommy Thompson. He couldn't compete against people who were coming along. But when his moment came, it was possible, and he took advantage of it.
Jim, what do you remember about that 50 years ago, that election, and what Pat Lucey's mindset was?
Yeah, so, I joined Pat's office in 1972, so he had been in office for a year. My memory of Pat is twofold. One is I was in Indiana in '68 doing some work for Bobby Kennedy and teaching at Purdue. And Pat was coming into the state to do some work, and I can tell that story later in the day. But and then I went to work for him. But in between those two periods, in the summer of '68, I had moved back to Wisconsin, and I went to a Pat Lucey event. And people had warned me, have you ever been to a Lucey event? And I said, no, I haven't, and I'm looking forward to it. And so we went into this relatively well-attended living room with about 25 people in it, and I was waiting for the stump speech and all the rest of that. And the soon-to-be governor reached into a briefcase or some sort of thing and pulled out a blue book. And for the next 25 minutes, talked to that group of people about the margins in different districts and why it was important that they vote. And when he had them sufficiently glazed over, he then dug into a very deep discussion about what was later to be called power equalization and all sorts of things. And I left there, and friend of mine, Les Aspen, called me up. He said, how'd it go? I said, Judas Priest. I said, I don't know if this guy can get elected, but he sure knows what the hell he's doing, and he knows why he wants to get there. And so let me close my first answer by, I think the thing about Pat that was so important in so many different ways, that he was entranced with and more familiar than most with what I think he would have called the power of politics as opposed to the power in politics. This was a guy who believed that things needed to take place. You read in the book that he had a list, an agenda that he kept on a piece of paper in his desk. That was real, okay? I mean, he kept score about whether he was making progress, on things that made a difference to people. Dennis talked about David Adamany's interest in doing a book. And from David's point of view, and if he was with us, I think he would say this. He viewed Pat Lucey and that administration as the third wave of progressivism in the state of Wisconsin. And so that agenda was important.
Well, last but not least, I want to go to Laurie Lucey now and take a peek inside her room. Welcome, Laurie.
Thank you. Happy to be here. I only wish my two brothers were here with us and David Adamany too, because I miss having all of them nearby. But thanks for having me.
Yes, and I'm so glad you could join us. I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the Kennedy connection, because we're looking inside your room. You're wearing a Lucy for Governor button from 1970 and designed by one of your brothers, right?
My brother David.
Yes. And then, there's a picture of Jack Kennedy and Bobby Kennedy there. And Lucy, your dad was the Kennedy man in Wisconsin. How do you remember the connection?
Well, I remember as a little girl peeking in the bathroom door that was open just a bit and seeing Bobby Kennedy shave. I remember as a 4 or 5-year-old, tucked away in the corner for late night meetings where Teddy Kennedy or Lem Billings, Kennedy's close friend, former roommate, were meeting and plotting how to advance their interests in the state. I remember my father, the day Jack Kennedy was shot, was on his way to Ohio to start preparations for running Kennedy's reelection campaign in '64 in Ohio. And then in '68, my dad traveled with Bobby Kennedy from state to state to state, was with him the night Martin Luther King was assassinated and the night that Kennedy took great risk to speak to a large crowd and in Indianapolis, the only major city in the country that didn't erupt in flames that night. And then my dad was with, there in Los Angeles the night he was killed. And so the Kennedy, connection was very, very strong. And both of my parents really admired and respected and worked hard for all three of the Kennedy brothers.
Right. So this is kind of a setup to the excerpt that we have. I'm plugging this because that's, 40 years ago, your dad was running as a vice presidential candidate with John Anderson. But they weren't running as Democrats; they were running as independents, and so that was quite a thing for. I think it had to do with Ted Kennedy versus Jimmy Carter and all of that, right? Do you remember much of that, Laurie?
I remember a lot of it, and I was in law school and actually took a semester off to be a part of that effort. But it really was more a concern about the incumbent and the direction the country was taking than it was about the Kennedys.
Okay, and can you just summarize a little bit about how your dad felt about the direction of the country? He felt strong enough to run on another ticket, but.
Well, I'm probably not the best person to ask that, to answer that question. But he had served Wisconsin for 2 terms as governor and then become ambassador to Mexico. And behind me is a picture of him presenting his credentials to President Jose Lopez Portillo. And he, over the course of that administration, I think he saw very big missed opportunities. President Carter was a man of great strengths and intellect and goodwill and has done so much for our country. He was less able to make a success of his presidency, unfortunately. And I think my father felt frustration with that.
Yeah, go ahead, Jim.
Yeah, the other thing, when you're looking for why is it strange that Pat Lucey is running as an independent? If you think about it, remember that he didn't run originally as a Democrat. He created a new Democrat Party in the state of Wisconsin. Okay? And my memory of him was always about what was the right thing to do. Okay? And so, you know, you take a look at the internal politics that Dennis writes well about in the book. You know, he and Gaylord Nelson disagreed at times. He and Adlai Stevenson disagreed. He and Hubert Humphrey disagreed. He had, you know, whenever Pat thought something should be taking place, that's what Pat decided he was going to do. He normally was able to deal with that inside the framework of the existing Democratic Party. But I don't find it strange, given 1980 and what was going on in 1980, that Pat made the decision he did. You know, he called a number of people from his administration and asked them to help and to participate. Some did, some didn't. Again, I think the story of Pat Lucey is, this is a guy who believed that there was a responsibility that came with being a politician, with being in politics. And that was always the road he took, at least when I saw it.
Joe, you want to weigh in on that in terms of what you remember from that time? Was that like, did that get everybody upset that Pat Lucey was bolting to another ticket?
I'd underscore Jim's point, which is we tend to think of the parties as they are roughly defined the last 5, 7, 10 years. That was not the case. Lucey created a party. He wove together interests and opposition to McCarthy and other features to create something new. And so his loyalty wasn't to prop something up and have something persist that was already around. It was to continuously inquire and make it better. And that freed him to take principal positions, which the better you got to know him, became less and less surprising. It wasn't a simplistic, he's a party man, a Mr. Democrat. No, he was a creative force that picked things that were very important to him and then found other people and pushed forward and challenged people to do better. So the idea that he was largely defined as something that we currently think of as a Democrat is just very wide of the mark. He was a principled creator of political space and political issues and political coalitions that invited people to react to and join. But he was not used to the categories we're used to.
Well, Laurie, this I think strong-willed might be an apt adjective. Was your father a strong-willed individual on certain principled issues like this?
You know, I saw my dad as a daughter, as a little kid growing up with her dad, who would, you know, be the one who would take us after church to the drugstore to Rennebaum's to buy candy. But, you know, as long as my mom didn't find out about it, it was all cool. I mean, I grew up with him as, and in the course of working on this book and speaking with Dennis and others, you know, I came to understand people who knew him from the outside as professionals working with him saw a very different person. I saw generous, kind, easygoing, good-humored, totally reliable, totally loyal, you know, a wonderful father. I couldn't have asked for more, except maybe more time. Although we did get till 96 with him, so that's pretty good. But I know some people maybe saw him and saw demanding, you know, work hard, constantly working. Where's the answer to that? Why haven't you gotten it to me yet? I don't know. I saw a wonderful father.
Easygoing is not a word I would have chosen, yes, but it's
Not in the office.
Back to Dennis Dresang. He's author of this new book, Patrick J. Lucey, A Lasting Legacy, from the University of, from the Wisconsin Historical Society Press. Dennis, what is your portrait of the man in terms of these kind of attributes we're just talking about now, you know, and about, you know, making this kind of decision to run on another ticket, and what you found out in writing the book? Dennis.
Yes, One of the things that struck me as I was going through and learning about Pat Lucey as a person as well as a political figure were the key kinds of choices that he made throughout his life. As I think, particularly those of us who grew up in Madison understand, Pat Lucey was a very successful business person as well. Had a great real estate business. I actually live on the edge of one of his major developments. And he had a father who was also very successful as an entrepreneur and business person. And when Pat got his degree at the University of Wisconsin, he had a choice. He was invited to go with his dad and work in the family business. And he was very tempted to do that, but Joe McCarthy appeared on the scene. And so Pat made a decision because he was very concerned about Joe McCarthy and the kind of demagoguery that was coming out, that he was not going to go into the business. Instead, he was going to devote himself to trying to move Joe McCarthy aside and pursue progressive kinds of issues. Another kind of major choice that he made came when we were talking about the assassination of Bobby Kennedy. In his oral histories, Pat makes clear he just got very depressed. He went into what he called a blue funk and was thinking about, gee, is public life really something that I want to continue? He had the option of going back into his business and spending full time with that. But instead, he was concerned about Vietnam. And because of his concern about Vietnam and what LBJ was doing in escalating our involvement, he decided, nope, I'm going back into it, and devoted himself very hard to trying to get Bobby elected. And then when that didn't work out, Gene McCarthy. And then when we talk about him running with Anderson, again, it was a very principled kind of decision. I mean, as we all have observed, here you got a guy who built the current Democratic Party in the state of Wisconsin. He's running as an independent. Give me a break. What's that all about? And one of the key things that Pat did before he agreed to be a vice presidential candidate with John Anderson, he was concerned about Reagan. He was concerned about Carter. But before he made any decision, he went through the platform that it was still in process, was being developed by Anderson. And he wanted to be sure that he was on board with that particular platform. And it's for Republican and Democratic parties and their presidential candidates, because it was put together by those two people and their staffs, rather than by committees and deliberation by delegates, which is a very different kind of dynamic and a very different thing. So the principled Pat Lucey is pretty impressive.
So you can read an excerpt on that episode at WisPolitics.com. I also want to remind our audience that you can ask a question through the chat function at the bottom of the Zoom webinar. You just hit Q&A down there and you can type in a question. After I go through some of my questions, we'll get to some of your questions. Let me move on to another topic here. And I want to stay with you, Dennis. The whole UW system thing, I think that for many of us in covering current day politics or involved in current day politics is really one of the lasting, the easy legacy takes on Lucey, and it's undergoing stress like never before: reorganization, financial stress, COVID outbreaks, you name it. But in retrospect, did he get it right?
I think he did get it right, and the main reason I say that, and one of the issues that's kind of interesting is the dynamics of getting the UW system established in the first place. Very visible political issue, and that in itself is a story. But in terms of, did he get it right? His main concern was, and this fit into a general concern that he had for having government work well, was that when we had when he took office, we had two different systems. One, University of Wisconsin system, which consisted of Madison, Milwaukee, Parkside, and Green Bay. And then all of the other campuses were in a different system, Wisconsin State University system. And the dynamic that concerned Pat Lucey was that this was really internally competitive. It was inefficient. It was not very effective. And indeed, if we had that system today, as we're trying to rethink, how can we have the university in a period of very scarce resources, a lot of challenges with COVID and the like, how can we have that move forward in a way which we maintain quality? It would have been very difficult to have that dynamic where the various universities are competing with one another for state dollars and for authority. And we have the two different systems that are competing with one another. So internally, that competition would have been very dysfunctional. I think it would have been a major challenge to help us move forward from where we are now.
Joe, I want to go to Joe. What do you think about that UW system piece and other pieces of the Lucey legacy that strike you?
Well, I think what I would emphasize is the range and breadth and depth of what he did. If you talk about tort reform, if you talk about the appellate court system, if you talk about state public defenders, if you talk about transportation policy, if you talk about the environment, if you talk about nuclear power, if you talk about the major sort of building blocks of the finance mechanisms of state government, how you raise it, and manufacturing machinery and equipment exemption, how you send it back out to municipalities and school districts. He recreated, examined carefully and recreated all of those things I just mentioned, including the university system. So I would say that the breadth and depth and range is completely unequaled, and one occasionally pays a price. And I think it is unfortunately noteworthy that Pat Lucey has never received an honorary degree or even been permitted to teach at the University of Wisconsin-Madison because of lingering concerns that he didn't strike the right balance many years ago. So that the work that he did was often not easy and often rearranged the influence and power good people. He organized a task force to study. And I think he definitely largely got it right. And we're living with the positive consequences of that today, where a Republican governor can be called out of retirement to lead threading some upcoming needles involving health and residential teaching and so forth, because it's a strong structure.
And Lucey did it without filling out the full 2 terms. Jim, what do you think of the other pieces of the Lucey legacy?
Well, I think both Joe and Dennis have done a good job of kind of the depth and breadth. Again, it is a tribute to somebody who wanted to get something done and who wanted to get it right. And it wasn't a matter of getting it right on Monday and Tuesday. It was a matter of a legacy, which is, hence the title, I think, is very, very apt. He handed the next 2 or 3 generations of Wisconsinites a better functioning government and a better functioning educational system than they had when he came into office. That's a fact, and I think the book underlines it, okay? And it leaves us with a responsibility to see what we can do to make sure that it continues to move forward in some sort of responsible fashion. The tension with the university folks was very real and harsher than it needed to be. People forget that when the bill was passed, the agreement was that there was going to be a commission that would work on putting the pieces together and defining what it was going to look like. So it didn't get all done just with that vote. It was another 2.5 years of negotiations, and every single damn negotiation produced irritation and misunderstandings on both sides. I think it is, again, another hallmark of Pat Lucey that he was never vindictive about it. He was just determined about it, okay? And so the issue for Pat was always about, how are we going to get this done? He wasn't, and he didn't mind talking to Republicans and talking to other folks in order to move the agenda forward. You couldn't take him off the objective. You couldn't take him off the purpose. but he was willing to talk to you about how you were going to get it done. And I think that's an important kind of, I am intrigued with the fact that on his wedding license, he listed his profession as a politician, okay? Imagine anybody doing that today. And you know what? It's okay, because the way he wore it, it was a title of pride and accomplishment. And I think, you know, that's, I'm reminded early in my career with the governor, I went in with all the massed wisdom I had managed to gather wandering around the state talking to constituents. And I was explaining to him why I didn't think he should do something in particular. And he listened patiently for about 30 seconds and then raised his hand and he said, Jim, he said, let me make something clear to you, okay? He said, my job is to govern. Your job is to get me reelected, okay? It's not my job to make your job easy, okay? It's your job to make sure the people of Wisconsin understand what I'm trying to get done. He said, anything else? I said, no, I'm done for the moment, Governor. I'll get back to you. So it was, I mean, again, so I think, you know, you have to look at the book and just the list that goes on and on and on and on, and that touches not just big scope things, but the internal operations of departments, qualifications, objectives. You know, I'll tell you one other story. I mean, again, this is the 70s, remember, when the computers are just kind of coming into being. And the Department of Revenue was doing computer work on the impact of different kinds of shared revenue formulas. And the governor and I were flying out to Washington, D.C., and we had left to fly to O'Hare to transfer to a larger plane. And he was going through this pile of these printouts. And he said, they've got it wrong. And I said, okay. He said, so we got to Chicago. He said, I want you to call Secretary of Revenue Wiegner and tell him that they've got this wrong. I said, what exactly am I supposed to say, Governor? Just tell him it's the stuff he gave me and he's got it wrong. And he pointed to a couple of pages. So I got Wiegner on the phone and he said, what do you mean we got it wrong? He said, he's looking at this ream of paper. He's not a computer specialist. I said, but he is the governor, Ed. And so as far as I'm concerned, the job is that when we get off the plane in Washington, D.C., you need to either be able to explain to him how you didn't get it wrong, or you need to acknowledge that you did, right? So you got an hour and a half. And that was Pat Lucey. We got to Washington and he said, do you want to talk to him? I said, no, Governor. I said, you're the one who thinks it's wrong. So he got on the phone with Ed, and within 30 seconds, he had hung the phone up. I said, do I need to do anything? He said, no, Wiegner's going to fix it now. So, you know, I mean, the capacity to get down to that level of detail. And throughout the campaign in '74, the trunk of his car was full of computer printouts. Wherever he went, he could talk to you about what shared revenue had meant, what power equalization had done for your school district. He was a manager. He understood this stuff, and he understood how it touched people and how it touched quality. Unique.
So, Laurie, I want to bring you in on this. What I mean, from your standpoint, you're hearing all these stories. I mean, what do you think about other pieces of the legacy that might come to mind for you?
Well, I'm working very hard myself right now in Georgia to help voters. I work full-time, which means 7 days a week and very long days since January on voter protection, a volunteer lawyer for the Democratic Party of Georgia. And as I reread the book, I'd read prior drafts, but as I reread the book this weekend, I was struck by the things my dad did in the 50s to build a Democratic Party, which Tommy Thompson said to me, he built a 4-decade juggernaut from, you know, a group of people who weren't even recognized as a party by the Democratic National Committee, as Joe and others were saying earlier. And he did this without a staff, without even anybody else on the payroll. and he was the comms director, and he was the field organizer, and he did candidate recruitment and training, and he did phone banking, started phone banking, and he did fundraising. And I mean, obviously Jim Doyle and, you know, Gaylord Nelson and John Reynolds and others were part of it, but he was the one staff person. And now we have, you know, hundreds of people doing these things in every state, but he was the guy who did it all, and doing it all as just the one guy built a party. And I was struck too, reading the, you know, list of accomplishments toward the end of the book, the you know, same day registration, I know, and registration by mail, and encouraging, making it easier for students to register in school, and making it easier for people with disabilities to vote. And I didn't know this, but abolishing voter purges in Wisconsin, which is something that we are dealing with in Georgia now, where if you don't vote for a couple of cycles, you're deemed to be forfeiting your right to vote. So he was ahead of us in so many ways in terms of organizing, building, creating a functioning party, as well as, you know, voter protection and making access to voting so much easier. So that to me has been a critically important part of his legacy.
I want to go to an audience question here, and chiming in is Dennis Conta, a former legislator who is close to Lucey. And I'm going to quote Dennis here. I'm certain that many people think that Pat entered the gubernatorial campaign with a strong organization and a deep bench. That certainly was not my experience. And I was surprised to discover how very few people were involved in the early stages of Pat's campaign when it launched. I had just been elected to the state legislature and was asked to become significantly involved, not knowing how few people were actually part of Pat's campaign apparatus. What thoughts could Jim and Joe, as well as Dennis, have about such a thin beginning? That's from Dennis Conta. So anyway, let's start with Dennis on that.
Well, and Dennis Conta played a key role in identifying the campaign manager for Pat's 1970 campaign run. It was a small staff, but you know, it was a very competent staff. And one of the things that I can say better than Joe and Jim is that he had a talent for identifying young people who were very, very bright, who were energetic, and who he wouldn't exploit them, but he would give them an opportunity to make major contributions. They were referred to often as the Kitty Corps because they were young and energetic. And it was really with that, it combined with the kind of thing that Laurie was referring to, and that is the kind of organization that Pat had been building up over the decades of the Democratic Party. You put those two together, and that's what happened. And he didn't have the advantage of social media or some of the other things that we are taking for granted today, but he sure did have a good staff.
Well, and it was a different time. So I understand exactly what Dennis is saying, which is true and accurate and portrayed in the book. But it's good news, quite honestly, in my opinion, that Pat had a thin staff at the top, okay? It is, you know, it's the old thing, you know, me and my brother know everything, okay? And so if I don't know the answer to your question, my brother does, and I'll go find it for you. Pat Lucey may have had a thin central staff, but you could throw a pin or stick a pin any place in the state of Wisconsin, and he knew somebody in that county, in that district, that you could go and talk to. And so, you know, when you talk about the kind of organizing that Laurie was referring to earlier, that stuff pays dividends, and Pat had been doing it for 20 or 30 years. And Wisconsin, then and now, is a state where people don't move around a lot, quite honestly. They stay where they're born and where they're raised and where they've got their jobs and stuff. So people he had met, you know, in the 1940s and 50s and 60s were there when he needed them to do something out there. And the advantage of being organized in that fashion is it reduces your costs considerably, because you don't have to hire people and put them on the road and drive all the way around. It was a very different age in terms of what you spent money on in politics and how that process worked. And so that was, I mean, my perception. I was running a congressional campaign for somebody in the Milwaukee area in 1970, and watched Pat's campaign from the sidelines. But he wasn't having any trouble getting meetings and finding places to go and talk to folks. So I guess that's my response. I don't know what Joe has to say.
Joe, what about what Dennis Conta had to say about a different kind of apparatus?
I joined the team in 1973, so I do not have any direct 1970 organizing things to offer.
Okay, let's talk a little bit about the kiddie corps again there. Larry Martin of the State Bar asked, how could you, he did an incredible job of recruiting talent. What was his, I guess, attitude toward that, recruiting people like you and Jim and others? Dennis, what about Lucy, the talent scout?
Yeah, I should point out that one of the things that Pat did was rely very heavily on David Adamany for his recruitment. David made a lot of connections and helped evaluate people, and Pat relied very heavily on David. But Pat had his own notion, and it's amazing to me, like going through all of the archival material and all of the interviews that I did, it's amazing to me how many people he took a chance on and how few, I mean, you can count on one hand the number that didn't work out, that were asked to leave or the like. It was just amazing. He just had this sense of who was there to be using their brain. They would be dedicated. And a lot of these people, it turns out, and I found this out from the interviews, a lot of these people were inspired to get involved in politics and public policy by John F. Kennedy, and heard that kind of call to arms and to duty that Kennedy had. So the Lucy Kennedy connection there was an important and interesting one.
So here's another question for anybody here. I think this is maybe for everybody. And I'll start with Laurie on this one. Could a Pat Lucey be successful today running for statewide office and having the impact he did? Could he do that in today's politics? Laurie, do you have some insight there?
Well, I sure hope so. I sure hope so. I think that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris are a team that are similarly people of integrity. But I can't speak directly about Wisconsin. I'm not there now, and you all know it better. But I sure hope so.
The governor would be so proud of you, Laurie, that you got the ad in there. That's good. That's good.
Never miss an opportunity. But Jim, what do you think? Would Pat Lucey have the same success today as he did 50 years ago?
Well, you know, Joe said early in the program that he was not a great retail politician. And I think that is probably true. But, and I hear Laurie say, I hope so. I think, you know, if you look at the campaigns, Pat's slogans were always about Lucy works for Wisconsin or working together, things of that sort. It's always about, you know, what the public ultimately finds. And I think the challenge today would be that we have divided where we get our information based upon what we want to believe or what we want to hear. And so the communication channels are tougher today than they were in 1970. That said, I think the country in the midst of this pandemic is increasingly aware of the need that it needs to upgrade its game in terms of policy making, decision making, and getting serious about getting stuff done. And so ironically, with all the problems that I think we have in terms of what's happened politically in gridlock, I think somebody like Pat Lucey would in fact have a shot if he got organized, if it was clear that the man's credentials and what he was able to bring to the table, I think that would be of real political value at this point in time.
Yeah, I agree. I think a major thing that would come across, even in the kind of period that we have now, is the civility of Pat Lucey. I think most of us are ready for somebody to unite us rather than continue to divide us. And he was somebody who was very, very keen on competency. And that was one of his concerns about Jimmy Carter. That was a reason why he went to the Kitty Corps. And that comes across a lot too. So he was somebody who's going to be basing policies on evidence, and he was not going to be a science denier. And so he'd be a real alternative to some of the things that people are reacting against.
Joe, you want to weigh in on that?
Well, I've been trying to think of someone who has an analogous sort of profile that has been successful recently. And the only person that comes to mind is the incredible RBG. Somebody who's extraordinarily capable, but not flashy and not out for a particular agenda that people start waving their flags, but just does it right and has the right approach and radiates, frankly, integrity. Radiates, I'm going to be very careful in the way I look at this and the way I proceed. But there are very few people who are able to break through the existing patterns of a news source these days. And I would hope there would be, but there are very few examples.
Yeah, and I guess I think the importance of the book and the importance of profiling, highlighting, showcasing a career like Pat Lucey's is that this country needs to attract people back to the political process, small p. We need to upgrade our commitment to public service and understand the need to, build an opportunity economy, to be able to see the middle class grow and prosper again, and to do that in a fashion which enables us to work together. So I think, while I appreciate the question of could he get elected today, I think the more important need at the moment is to inspire people to understand that civil politics is possible, that civil politics can produce results that work for people up and down the street and across the world.
So maybe that's the relevant. Oh, I'm sorry, Joe. Go ahead.
I'd like to invite Dennis to pursue, at least briefly, a topic that he pursued with Stuart Levitan in another interview, which to me partly opened up the pathway that Lucey used to empathize with people that he had no experience, common experience with. He came from a very small town in a rural part of the state with no diversity in its immediate Lutherans and Catholics. And he, for a lifetime, was able to identify with those who were not getting a fair shake, for those who were being shortchanged by systems that others had built. And he decided to do something about it. And I thought, Dennis, your reflection on the religious and the social context of his youth was insightful.
Well, thanks, Joe. Yeah, the point that I was making in that discussion was that Pat came from Ferryville, a town on the Mississippi in western Wisconsin, very, very tiny, still is. And he was in a family that had a strong Catholic tradition, Irish heritage that they were proud of, and the community that he was in was Norwegian Lutherans. So they were in a real minority, and he did have a sense of what it was like to grow up and really be very different, and to do what's necessary to reach out and build those bridges. And I think it's important to note too that it's not only a Catholic Irish tradition that he grew up in, but it was a Jesuit tradition. And he had two brothers, and his brother Greg has just moved back to Wisconsin. Welcome back, Greg. They were both Jesuit priests. And in fact, Pat himself almost became a Jesuit priest. And it's only because he couldn't quite master Greek, which at that time was required. So He went into politics instead of becoming a Jesuit. But it's that kind of a tradition of a social action, social justice that I think is very important, that it informed him. And as as Joe points out, I mean, he was a real pioneer in many civil rights issues, open housing as a real estate person. And a lot of that can really be attributed to it. And it's interesting too, to just add, when Pat first joined what is today the Democratic Party, he was seen as a specialist in farms, in agriculture, in part because he came from that background. And at the Constitutional Convention of the current Democratic Party, Pat was designated as the spokesperson for the rural and farm areas. And I think a lot of people don't fully appreciate that because they identify Democrats with urban areas.
Yeah, I also want to bring up this, you brought up before, Dennis Dresang, the author of this new book, about Pat Lucey as the real estate man, very successful. He and his wife built a very successful real estate business in Madison. But that, I think, goes to what Jim and Joe and Laurie are saying about his ability to talk to all different kinds of people. You start the book about him meeting the guys, the union guys at the plant gate, and dragging Jack Kennedy to those things. But he was also able to talk to business people, to residential homeowners about all these issues. I guess it was this, where did that business acumen come in terms of electability and ability to make deals?
Well, one of the things that was notable about Pat is that he was a listener, as has been pointed out, and Pat himself says, I'm not a charismatic person. Nobody accused him of being that kind of a spokesperson and that kind of an orator. He listened. And it was a real contrast when he was running for office, that all of his ads and the way he portrayed himself was as a listener. And I think that's very important in these kinds of communications. The other thing that I should point out, because I think that is really critical, is that Pat Lucey went into real estate. He could have gone into other businesses too. He went into real estate because he was encouraged to do so by Jim Doyle Sr. in response to a question that Pat had, which was, what kind of a business can I go into that will allow me to continue to be active in politics and public policy? So we know about a lot of people in real estate who get involved in politics to serve their real estate business. And almost inevitably that leads to corruption and some shady kinds of practices. For Pat, he was in real estate because it gave him flexible schedule and it gave him an opportunity to get involved in politics and public policy. A major, major kind of difference.
I feel compelled to stand up for the number of realtors who aren't corrupt and all the rest of that. It's an honorable profession for most people. But I think there's one other piece that's really important about that business background. When Pat was doing all policy stuff that he did, he had a sense of the importance that you had to figure out how to pay for this stuff. You couldn't just pass it and pass on the bills to the next generation. So almost everything that he did was done in what I would describe as a sustainability mode, which is to say you got to find the revenue coming from someplace, and it has to be related to the activity that you're pursuing or that you're trying to reform or whatever. And I think that side of his business persona was very, very persuasive to other business people, regardless of their partisan affiliation. And so not all business people in Wisconsin loved Pat Lucey when he was running for office, but most of them respected him, and none of them believed that he didn't understand what the hell he was talking about. And so, I think, and it's part of why what he accomplished has lasted as long as it has, because it held together fiscally in terms of how it put together. So.
Okay, just a speculative question for Dennis Dresang, or for anybody else who wants to pop in here. This is from a listener. Given the closeness to the Kennedys, do you think he would have joined an RFK administration had there been one?
Oh, I don't think there's any question. I think that if Bobby Kennedy had been elected as president, that I think he, number one, would have reached out to Pat Lucey. He had a great deal of respect to Pat. And Pat himself would respond in a number of like oral histories when talking about the Kennedys, that he had a great deal of respect and admiration for all three of the brothers, but especially for Bobby. He really felt very, very close to Bobby. So I think that Bobby would have given him an opportunity, and I think that Pat would have accepted it right away.
Yeah, I agree completely.
Okay, let's we got about 5 minutes here, and I want to close with some closing thoughts and maybe reflect a little bit more on what lessons there are from Lucey's life and legacy and tenure as governor, and what could be applied to today's politics, which I think all of you would agree are a lot meaner and less civil than they used to be. So again, what are the lessons that we could take from that? Practical lessons, not wishful lessons, I guess, that we can apply to today's politics and the Lucey legacy. So let's start with Joe on that one.
Well, very briefly, I think that his approach to the Democratic Party of setting out some principles and evolving those and not seeking an institutional structure. You take union, you take farmers, you take manufacturers and realtors, and you put them together. That wasn't the way he looked at the world and the way he opened himself up to the possibilities. And I think that that's a very, very healthy instinct as we identify parts of our society that many of us have not personally experienced, but we've got to weave together better.
Okay, Jim.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that. I keep trying to figure out how to articulate this, but I go back to the fact that the governor was committed to fixing things or to moving things forward and bringing people together around the concept of solutions. And so, I mean, I think we've all probably been guilty of thinking that the job was done when we defended our values or we defended our particular philosophy or whatever the hell it is at the moment. And I think the lesson in Pat Lucey is, given the kinds of problems we're confronting here, we all need to maybe come together around solving the problems and make that the first order of business. That doesn't mean you have to give up your values or your principles, but it does mean that you got slightly more responsibility and you need to put in longer hours and work harder and smarter.
Okay, Laurie Lucey, what relevance of your dad's tenure in politics and legacy could be applied to today?
Well, I don't know if this answers your question, but this is what I want to say. I have been very grateful in the last 4 years that my dad was not alive to live through this time. I think it would break his heart to see the level of malevolence and depravity that is characterizes Washington particularly, and it would break his heart. So I'm glad he hasn't had to live through the last 4 years. However, I think he would now be very hopeful and very encouraged because of the response of so many people who are basically determined to rise up and smite the beast, is how I think of it, who are the grassroots, which is where he started, as Dennis so well laid out in his book, building a party not of interests that are aligned and massive, sort of power structures that decide to get together for but a grassroots organization of people who have needs, who have concerns, who have integrity, and who are demanding a fair and equal shake in the world and integrity and decency from their government. So I think his legacy will ultimately be, will prevail and will be successful because it has to be.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that reflection. Okay, Dennis Dresang, author of this new book on Pat Lucey. Dennis, what do you think is the relevant the relevance we should take from the Lucey tenure of 50 years ago and apply it to today?
Well, I would start out by remembering a comment that was made by David Obey at the memorial service for Pat Lucey. And Representative Obey said, you know, Pat Lucey would outsmart you, he would outmaneuver you, but he would never outmean you. And I think that sums it up very nicely. He was a very, very smart person, but he was also very, very civil. And Pat Lucey did not look at government as a necessary evil. He looked at it as something that is in our society to serve the common good and to do good things. And it should be respected, and the institutions should be respected. And he would be very, very proud of his daughter, Laurie, for what she's doing on voting, because that was an institution that Pat Lucey certainly found as fundamental to everything else that goes on. And, you know, those of us in Wisconsin are still grateful for same-day registration, for the ease that we have of getting absentee ballots. Those are part of the legacy, as well as, and we talked about other institutions like the UW system. And that was just a part of his legacy that I think is going to be treasured for a long time.
So I'm going to add this from the leaf of the book here from Tommy Thompson. Perhaps the greatest testament to Governor Lucey's leadership is the fact that the only thing he enjoyed more than politics was governing and getting things done. That's from Tommy Thompson. Okay, so that brings us to a close. Thank you, Dennis Dresang, author of the book, Patrick J. Lucey, A Lasting Legacy. Thank you to Joe Sensenbrenner, Jim Wood, and especially Laurie Lucey. Really appreciate it. And I want to thank our sponsors for this event. The sponsor board is coming up now to help me. Thank you. Hush Blackwell, American Family Insurance, Walmart, Xcel Energy, ARP Wisconsin, and the Wisconsin Hospital Association. Please remember to tune in tomorrow, September 23rd, for our next virtual event, a look at the women vote in Wisconsin this election year. That takes place at noon and lasts till about 1 o'clock. So we'll see you tomorrow, and thanks everybody for participating today.